Jack warrior, Janamara, Bonaparte warrior, hang away, Digital warrior, crazy horse, black collar warrior.
I want you to the second part of the episode 13, in which we commenced, last, which was titled A Cultural Crime Against the Kyana Gallery. This podcast, Tribal Fires, is coming out of the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation in Perth, Western Australia. And this is a second chapter to the previous episode, because what we want to do is we want to talk about two very important aspects of the gallery before we wind up and collectively end that whole story within the podcast series. And we want to talk today about some of the major acquisitions in which Dumbartung has acquired through the number of years that the gallery was evolving and developing. And they're very interesting in terms of, some of the art and artists that we spoke about in the first part of the episode. But I want to just go back to join some of the dots, which, in that first part of this episode, looked at the letters in which we received from Lottery West and the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation regarding what had happened to Dumbartung's promised gallery and submission from Lottery West, and how in the end Dumbartung had come out rejected and the submission failed to be funded. And I want to just start by stating that I think an important part of that is to look at the letters in sequence. So the first letter that we received after putting the submission in was a huge letter of congratulations, and it was in big bold black lettering up top of the letter, and it stated that Lottery West has approved your funding for a gallery, and that Mark McGowan, the Premier of Western Australia, has signed off on that, and that Dumbartung can expect a visit from a MLA, and that we can afford to promote that on all of our social network systems such as Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, you name it. Lottery West was saying to promote it out and to give credence to its administration, being Lottery West, and its players and its distributors. So, Dumbartung went about doing that, and, we thought we had secured that funding. It was there in black and white. Then, as was, discussed in the episode, in the first session, was that we then received a letter after the quantity surveyor had done all the cost factoring and laid out the costs of the gallery to Lottery West, that we received a secondary letter signed off by Lorna Pritchard that actually, rejected the submission and said, regretfully, Lottery West's decision was to not go ahead with the funding for the Dumbartung Gallery. And that was really extremely confusing because, again, the decision to fund Dumbartung, that gallery, came from the top levels of Lottery West. That was from their chairperson and their CEO down to Dumbartung as in terms of an offer. We didn't put a submission in originally until we were asked to by Lottery West board. So I just wanted to, connect those two particular important letters. And then I want to now also talk a bit about the eviction. And we just touched on this in the previous episode. And that was from the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation regarding when we occupied the west wing of the kitchen and the old dining room area here at Clontarf. And that space was good enough for Dumbartung to be able to put up the vast majority of our collection. And when people entered that gallery, there was always a form of, a little bit of shock and awe in terms of the beauty and the impact that the gallery had on the public, and particular on our people and the young people. And, we were proud of that gallery, but there was the issue, if you remember, that we spoke about, which was the leaking of the roof through the storm fronts that would hit us in the particularly winter months, and, how the gallery would virtually, be flooded out, and we couldn't take public in there when the whole gallery was near flooded. So, we applied to ILC to ask them whether they would, consider fixing the fabricated ceiling for us, which was, put on by the Christian Brothers after the kitchen area, had no longer served the purpose of the dining room for the orphans. And they said that they would go ahead and they would, fix the roof. However, we literally just had to move all of our artwork and artefacts and photographic exhibitions out of that area first, store them or have them looked after. And then once they would repair the roof, and they put an expectation of, a couple of months on this process, that Dumbartung would be able to move directly straight back into the area and re-establish our collection. So, to us, that was good. We were, going to at least rid ourselves of the peril of water and the damage water can do to a collection like the Kyana collection. So, when we did move out the collectives and we had them stored while this supposed work was to take place, what we noticed as time went on, there was never any repairs done to the ceiling and the roofs. So we kept on, reapproaching ILC and their then state manager of the Western Division, Kate Alderton, about why, it was taking so long to get, builders or people to repair the ceiling in. And anyway, we got to a point of where we received a letter from the ILC. And during the process and leading up to, just prior to receiving this letter, myself and Selena were just wandering over and around the area of the entry of the old gallery, and we saw a worker there with the doors open and obviously drilling at, and when we looked at what he was doing, he was actually changing the locks on the doors. So that would then obviously deter our key from turning the lock, and they had locked us out, or in the process of locking us out. And, look, that was without any discussion that we had with them in terms of what would be, the future of that room and that area. And I rang Stephen Sharp. I remember ringing him, not long after myself and Selena saw the locks being changed. And I said to him, well, look, Stephen, what is it that Dumbartung is to do with the sacred objects that were within our collective? And when I talk about sacred objects, I mean the objects that the public cannot see or uninitiated people, particularly women, weren't allowed to view. And they were being kept in a small room within that bigger room. And he said to me quite straight out, and, he said, well, look, the best I can do for you is supply you a tradies toolbox and you can put them into that. I said, well, you've got to be joking, don't you? I said, what do you mean a toolbox? He said, yeah, I can, they're steel, they're aluminium. Robert, you can put the objects in the toolbox and, they lock, they're safe. I said, well, that may be. I said, but we don't have any room where we can put them out of sight unless we put them into the ablution area of the Dumbartung office here. He said, well, if you need to put them in the toilet, that's where you put them. And that's the sort of response we were getting from bureaucrats who were commissioned to show some form of respect and to work with Aboriginal community-based organisations in regards to looking after culture and cultural collections. So to me, that was a shock, as I said previously in the last episode, and it caused a lot of concern for ourselves here at Dumbartung, because we were now locked out and our collection was basically being put up into the rooms within this area that makes up the office, and the rest were going into storage. And we received a letter from Kate Auderton, who was the then Western Division Manager. And I'll just get Selena to read out the letter, and then I'll just reiterate on a couple of points within the letter before we move on to the title of this part of the episode, A Cultural Crime Against the Kyana Gallery, and we're calling this The Acquisitions.
This letter was received from the Indigenous Land Corporation on 17th of December 2013. Dear Robert, Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation Tenancy Agreement for 2014. Thank you for your recent letter, and my apologies for the delay in response. I note that various discussions between our respective organisations and Lottery West have transpired since receipt of your letter. Specifically, I note the outcomes of the meeting held at Lottery West office on 9 December, where agreement was reached regarding leasing and financial arrangements in relation to Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation's operation in 2014. This letter will set out the Indigenous Land Corporation's position in relation to this matter. ILC repairs to Kyana Gallery building. As you are aware, the ILC has undertaken a structural engineering assessment of the building that currently accommodates the Kyana Gallery. This building, both the Kyana Gallery section and the former kitchen, requires capital repairs to its supporting roof structure, roof tiles, ceiling, and heritage tower. The ILC plans to commence these repair works in 2014, and as such will not be renewing the lease agreement for the Kyana Gallery area with Dumbartung. As advised by Dumbartung, the ILC understands that the Kyana Gallery collection will be relocated to the West Australian State Museum for the period during which the ILC will be undertaking works on the building. The ILC will advise Dumbartung by 31 January 2014 of a date by which all items will need to be removed. Once repairs are complete and the building is considered structurally sound for the future occupation, the ILC will provide Dumbartung with the first right of refusal for its future tenancy. In order to take this up, Dumbartung will need to demonstrate to the ILC board that it meets the ILC's criteria for assistance, meaning Dumbartung must be operating in a variable and sustainable manner and able to meet its financial obligations under any future tenancy arrangement. Former Clontarf Management Office. I note that in March 2013, Dumbartung took over the additional space adjoining its office, referred to as the former Clontarf office. The ILC agreed to this expansion on the basis that Dumbartung were in a position to cover its cost. As this is not the case, the ILC will be subsidising Dumbartung's accommodation on Clontarf campus for the next 12 months. It is requested that this area is vacated by 31 January 2014. The campus coordinator will liaise with you to ensure Dumbartung's belongings are removed and the area is appropriately separated from Dumbartung's main office area with the construction of a secure wall. I trust this arrangement will be of assistance to Dumbartung during this difficult time. The ILC wishes to continue its engagement with Dumbartung regarding its options for the future and looks forward to cooperative and productive relations over the next 12 months. Please free to contact me should you wish to discuss this matter further. Yours sincerely, Kate Alderton, Manager, Western Division. C.C. Lorna Pritchard, Lottery West.
I just want to refer to just a few points within that letter, because I found the letter, following Dumbartung's occupancy at Clontarf being then in excess of 30 years on the campus, and, all of the work that Dumbartung had done in a multitude of sites in and around Clontarf over a long period of time, to be, not only offensive, but to give credence to the very deceit in which, was the agreement to commence with. They go on to talk in the letter about the renovations, if you like, and the structural issues dealing with the whole of the building, in which Selena also commented on what she relayed to when she mentioned the bell tower. We were only talking about one western wing part of that entire building. We weren't talking about the whole dining room cum kitchen area. That was the agreement that was reached by Dumbartung and ILC. So then when they mentioned then that they were going to do contractual work and put it to tender to do up the whole building, well, of course, we wouldn't have had enough funding in our budget to be able to pay for the rent structures that would go with that entire given area. And they knew that, and they played on that. And secondly, there was never, ever an agreement with ILC that Dumbartung would commence discussions with the West Australian Museum to store our collection in the museum until such times as that work was done out, because there was no timeline on the work, again, as opposed to just that smaller area which we first thought that we were talking to ILC about. So look, when you look at, that letter and you look at what was the original issue that was raised by Dumbartung, it was a very, very clever and strategical way planned by quite a skilled bureaucrat to evict Dumbartung out of that building, change the locks, as we said earlier, and then offer, toolboxes for the most sacred of objects that, were part of ceremonies that go back so far in time in this country. That these ceremonies no longer are carried out on the land. So how can you really be instructed by bureaucrats to put sacred objects into tool boxes and then into because I said to Stephen Sharp quite clearly we had no storage area inside the Dumbartung offices for these toolboxes. And that's when he said, well, put them within the ablution block area. So in other words, they wanted and made mention of safekeeping of these objects, which are sacred to our people and our culture, into ablution blocks. And I don't think I've ever heard anything more spiritually offensive nor cultural degrading than those comments. And, those people should be held accountable, by our community for these sorts of processes and strategical decisions that they made to suppress Dumbartung down into the most stringent spaces that we could occupy on the campus. And I want to also state that as we did move our objects and our artworks into storage, they remain there some 13 years later. And that's how long it's been since that first letter was written, right up to this point in time here. Kate Alderton went on, and she is now the Director of Aboriginal Policy and Coordination in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Kate Alderton is also the major officer, to whom I believe chairs the committee that will develop the new concept, which is the state-based cultural centre, which the government has planned for being built adjacent to Elizabeth Quays and just behind Supreme Court Gardens at a cost of $280 million. And I find that absurd, because how can our people, first and foremostly, see a non-Aboriginal woman director of our cultural business and our cultural issues? And, again, this is the same person to whom evicted Dumbartung basically from the old dining room, kitchen area of the orphanage. And I think there should be an outrage, there should be an outcry from our community, particularly those Aboriginal people who are working in and around that policy coordination unit of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And we should make sure Aboriginal people are in them positions to make these decisions. So, we'll move into what we really have come to call this part of the episode, and I think it's really important, which is the acquisitions. And I just want to talk very briefly about a number of acquisitions of materials in which Dumbartung is repatriated and brought back to our collective. And I want to start off by talking about receiving a phone call one day from an elderly woman down at Boynup. And she was saying to me over the phone that her grandfather was one of the old prison wardens down at the Fremantle prison, and that, out in her shed at the back of her place at Boynup, there was a number of Aboriginal artworks and tables in which were done inside Fremantle prison, that she, and her family had made a decision to, donate to the Kyana gallery if Dumbartung, desired to do so. So, of course, I said to her very quickly that, Dumbartung would be, very, very appreciative of the offer, and that we would certainly come down to Boynup and have a look at the, the artworks that she had in the old, as she said, colorbond shed. And I approached an elder who was living at the time. She's now and since passed away, so rest in peace to Violet Newman. And Violet was also an active member of the Dumbartung Committee. So myself and Violet drove down to Boynup, and we, knocked on the front door of this country townhouse, and, this woman answered the door, and she first took us into her lounge room because she had other, objects and artworks from the Fremantle prison that she said she just wanted to show us, and that the family had, definitely made decisions that they were going to keep these particular objects and artworks. And, well, all I could do was have a look and think to myself, wow, what a collection of incredible works. Because I remember seeing coffee tables that were, painted and made by people like Revel Cooper. There were beautiful artworks by Ralph Woods and Gary Woods and Reynold Hart. I remember, there was a massive collection, and they were beautiful works. However, she said to myself and Violet just to go around the back, and we walked around the side of the house and through a gateway into the backyard. She'd gone through the back door and met us out in the backyard, and she said, "Look, Mr. Eglinton, just come over to the shed here. They're in here." And I said, "Well, okay." And anyway, she started struggling a little bit with the doorway into the colorbond shed, because it was a sliding door. And I remember the door getting a bit jarred up in the grit of the sand and the dirt. And, so she's sort of tugging on the door. And, as I saw the first sort of light go into the shed, I could see, the beginning of some of the formations of the artwork. Anyway, she had struggled and grappled enough with the sliding door that it had opened, and she started to bring out these most incredible paintings. And there was one of the paintings done by Revel Cooper that consisted of a number of horses within a landscape. And it was the first time I ever saw, really, an Aboriginal artist paint horses. as we all know, they're an introduced species of animal into this country. But there they were, and Revel Cooper had painted them, and I saw his beautiful flowing symmetry at the bottom of the artwork. And then she pulled out, another few pieces of artwork done by Malcolm Ellis, and there was a number of these incredible artworks that you could just know from the very moment you saw them, if you were familiar with prison work and prison art, that they were from the major prison systems. And of course, these ones were from Fremantle prison. And then she brought out a couple of the coffee tables that were, again made as a production line of manufactured artworks that the prison would actually sell on the outside of the prisons, and the artists wouldn't receive any nature of remuneration for their work. It was done in prison time and in prison property. So the prison claimed ownership of all these works, and that's how these wardens and superintendents had become in possession of some of the Southwest's most historically and the most beautiful pieces of artworks. And anyway, she pulled the last painting out, and I'll never, ever forget my reaction to this piece of work. It was done by, the grandfather of the Carrolup art movement, Revel Cooper, again. And as she, sort of tried to pull the painting out, I could see, although it had a wooden frame on it, started to scratch up against the door and the front of the Colorbond shed. So I just said to her, well, look, let me give you a hand with this one. And out of this shed came, something as magnificent as a rainbow in the dark cloud of rain as it sees sunlight. And it was the most beautiful painting, and is probably the most important artwork that is in the Dumbartung collection to this very day. And I remember bringing all of this collection from Boyanup back to Dumbartung, and my first reaction was just to call Professor John Stanton from the Burnt Museum, and I did, and I said, look, John, I've just been to Boyanup and I've got this magnificent collection of Revel Cooper's works and a couple of Reynold Hart and other artists, and I know and fully understood Professor John Stanton's relationship with the Carrolup art and his academic interests. So, the professor was over here within, minutes. He said, hang on, Rob, I'll come straight over. And he did. And, as he entered Dumbartung, I'll never forget, him again looking at all the works, but I'd put this particular one of Revel Cooper's aside. And, when he said to myself, he said, you've got an incredible collection of repatriated works here. I said to him, look, John, I want to show you this one though. And I took him into another part of Dumbartung where I had it, because I knew what his reaction would be. And he looked at it and he said, look, I'm not sure, Rob, what your response will be or what your reaction will be. He said, but I just must have this painting for the Burnt Museum's collection of Revel Cooper's works. He said, what price would you put on that? I said, well, it's priceless, John, and it's not for sale. And he smiled that away. He said, look, what I would do, he says, and I really need to do it for Dumbartung, he says, I will box frame most of these works, he said, but particularly this one here, he said, because in all of my years as an anthropologist working within the Carrolup art and artworks from right across Western Australia, including the Western Desert Block, he said, this particular painting, he said, I'd put within the top 3 of the most historically beautiful and important artworks to ever merge out of the southwest of Western Australia. And of course, when we talked earlier about the Significant Assessment Award, these are the sorts of works that went into creating that status and that award for Dumbartung. So that painting, unfortunately, as we speak today, is in storage, and probably won't see the light of day for a long time. And this again is the, I suppose, the shame and the disappointment of not having this, gallery built for Dumbartung. I also want to just brief on another incredible acquisition of Dumbartung. It was through a woman to whom just appeared at Dumbartung's door one day. Her name was April Sutherland. She was all and every bit of the age of 88 when she got to Dumbartung. And, she was still sprightly. She drove here. She was still very sort of, for a very elderly woman, you could see that within her youth she would have been beautiful, like an angel. And April spoke to myself and Selena and told us a story about, she was a wood carver and she was at one of the TAFE courses, and one of her, works was that she had to, carve from wood a Aboriginal figurine or an Aboriginal sort of entity. So what she chose to do was to carve an Aboriginal man's face. And I thought to myself, what a great choice. And she said to us, I didn't want to carve it though from a photograph or a magazine or, somebody even sitting there. She said, Robert, I really wanted to carve it from a piece of artwork that was done by an Aboriginal person. And she then went on to tell us that she was advised by a friend of hers that there was a inmate at the Fremantle prison who was quite seldom in prison, and his name was Revel Cooper, and that, possibly he may respond to a request to paint a face for you to be able to carve into wood. So she made contact with the Fremantle prison, and lo and behold, within a month or so, she was in the prison, and not within the visitors section, as she had been taken to Revel Cooper's cell. And she was saying to me and Selena, he'd just come out of sleep, and he sort of woke to this, what then would have been this most beautiful looking woman at the bed end of his bed, and, asking him whether he would do a painting of a Aboriginal man's, head for her to carve into wood. And, it often brings a smile to my face and a bit of a laugh, because she indicated to us the glee that seemed to appear into the eye of Revel Cooper. And anyway, she got a very positive response from Revel Cooper, and she went back, I think it was 3 weeks or there later, and Revel Cooper had done actually 6 or 7 of these most incredible sketches and etchings of Aboriginal men's faces, some adorned in ceremonial, attire, if you like, ceremonial gear, and then others just the normal face structures. So anyway, she chose one and she carved it into wood. And when she pulled out the carving of the wood of this painting, I just could not believe my eyes. And again, it makes up an incredible part of the collective here at Dumbartung. And Selena will just read now just a short message and part of the story in which April gave to us, as in a signed letter, given authenticity to the story. The authenticity of the paintworks and the paintings were within Revel Cooper's own signatories anyway. But Selena will read the letter that came from April Sutherland.
Letter from April Sutherland, June 2005. I was born in Kenya, East Africa. I met and married Ken, who had recently arrived from Scotland. 14 years later, we migrated to Perth with our 3 children. I decided to join night school. I learnt wood carving at TAFE Night School at Rossmoyne, eventually teaching there for 18 years. In 1973, it was my desire to carve an original Aboriginal, and with this in mind, a friend suggested that I contact Fremantle Prison as a constant inmate. Revel Cooper was there. The authorities granted my request. This is Revel's story. He loved to draw and paint, but found it difficult at home. There was too many people in the house. It was noisy, very distracting, and concentration was impossible. So he found his own solution. This was to steal cars. Once back in prison where life was organised and a lot quieter, he was able to indulge his creative talents with no interruption. Revel kindly agreed to draw me a portrait of an Aboriginal elder. When I returned to the prison to collect my drawing, I was delighted to find he had given me 6 portraits of a wonderful choice. 30 years later, it is my pleasure to donate these portraits and the carving I made of the elder to the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation Art Gallery and to Robert and Selena Eggington.
I think it's the most amazing story. It really is. If you put your mind back to that particular story and the one at Boynup, and we'll go through one or two more before we conclude the this part of the episode of this cultural crime against our gallery, because I think what it shows is that all of the works in which Dumbartung has within the collective have got these massive stories, which are amazing stories of the journey of how these artworks actually have come into our collective. And I think this particular one from April Sutherland, and how her desire was to carve an Aboriginal man's face from wood, and she done a most incredible job of that, and you can see that, and you will see that within the images that come up in this part of episode 13. And I just want to now go on to a response that we had from a phone call from the old Rose and Crown Hotel in Guildford and near Midland here in the Perth area. And I got a call from the 2 old people that were running the Rose and Crown, and they were in the process of actually closing down the hotel. And over the years, they had built up this massive and huge collection of really very, very important Aboriginal artefacts. There was no artworks, it was just artefacts. And I went with a senior anthropologist from the Perth West Australian Museum, Mr. Peter Bindon. He was head of the whole Aboriginal sector of the Western Australian Museum. And we got to the Rose and Crown, and we met with the lady who owned the hotel. And she said, look, Mr. Eggington, I'll take you to the area where all these artefacts and objects are. So I went with the anthropologist, and we were really taken back, because this collection was massive, and it was made up of pre-colonial Noongar kailis, or what's commonly known as boomerangs. There were some Noongar shields in the collection. There was a lot of objects that they should not have had in their collection. How they got them, I don't know. I didn't ask any questions about that. But I did say to the anthropologist, we must get those from the collection and bring them into the vaults of Dumbartung, because they were what you would call sacred ceremonial objects. And, look, there were objects from the Western Desert Block. So they were right from throughout Western Australia and from, Central Australia. Anyway, we had, put marks on, because she said, look, just mark everything you need, take what you can today, and then mark the rest. Come back early in the morning prior to the auction starting, because they were all going to be auctioned off. But whatever you mark, Mr. Eggington, will be put aside for you for the Dumbartung Kyana Gallery collection. So anyway, myself and the anthropologist took out a massive amount the first day we got there. We took out some really old Noongar boomerangs. We took out the shields. We took out everything that we could carry and that we had been given a box by the old lady that we could put into the box. But I marked probably, I would say, another 40 or 50 objects that were so significant. And I said to Peter Bindon that maybe we should come back, put these in the vehicle, come back and get them. and he said, I can remember his words to this very day. No, Rob, they're very sincere. You know, you'll get them in the morning. We'll come back over tomorrow morning and we'll pick up the remaining number of objects. So we did that. And we got there just prior to the auction taking place. And the auctioneer was there, though, at this time. And, you know, all the people bidding were in place. And anyway, I said to Peter Bindon, what are we doing sitting amongst the bidders, Peter? Why don't we just pick up what we had marked and go along with them? He said, well, I approached the auctioneer and they said, no, you can't do that. We're just going to put aside the ones that you've marked. And to my absolute dismay and to my, ill feeling in a lot of ways, those objects that we had marked that were for Dumbartung to pick up all of a sudden went under the hammer and were being bidded for. And I looked at Peter Bint and I said, Peter, they're supposed to be the ones we've come to pick up and to take back to Dumbartung. He said, well, I don't know what's happening here, Rob. And one company, which was Italia Air, which was the Italian Airways company, had just put up their bidding card in the air, and I'll remember it just stayed there because I knew then that we needed to start bidding for these objects if we wanted to acquire them. However, they just went to a point where I knew Dumbartung didn't have the funding or the money to purchase these objects from the auction. And, you know, I did make my complaint known to the lady who first rang us, and, you know, she said that it was beyond her control. She didn't realise or know that they were going to auction, and she had spoken to the auctioneer about the fact that they were supposed to be given to Dumbartung, but he played dumb, and he said he wasn't really made aware of what, you know, was supposed to happen. So therefore he made his profit of percentage of the selling of each of the objects, and Italian Air were the owners. And I wrote a letter to the Italia Air saying and telling them of that story and what had happened. However, I never ever got a response back. Although there's many, many stories of how Dumbartung has, you know, repatriated and been given, you know, donations by the public, and how all of this artwork has come together, you know, that really is a very important part of the gallery and its concepts. And as we mentioned again in the first part of the episode, in the last recording, was that you would never get the funding or the money to actually, you know, at this level of operation to, you know, from government to start up a gallery. They wouldn't fund money for, you know, purchasing of artworks or, you know, buildings that were, you know, structurally sound and with some form of dignity to, you know, exhibit our culture, certainly not at a grassroots level and a community-based level in which Dumbartung works. So, you know, these stories are really important in terms of how, you know, this collective has, again, developed parallel with our initiatives over all these years. One really important repatriation was done through a Noongar man here in Perth. He rang me and he had said, look, Rob, I'd come across these old statues that used to be in the Aboriginal Advancement Council for many, many years, and for, you know, senior Aboriginal people. Most maybe are gone now, passed away, but there would be some Noongar people out there who would remember the three statues that were in the Advancement Council. One was this huge Aboriginal man, and one was the woman who was with the man, and then the other was a child. And they stood for years and years in the Aboriginal Advancement Council in Beaufort Street, just opposite Beaufort Park. And there would be, in those days that these statues were in East Perth, they were the days of, you know, the fringe dwellers, from the Bull Paddock, Miller's Cave and Starlight Hotel, the last of the stolen generations. This is how far these statues go back. Anyway, this Aboriginal fella, Noongar fella, rang me and said, well, look, you know, I've got two of the statues, Rob, I got from a dumpster. They were on their way to be, you know, basically thrown out. And I said to him, well, look, just hold on to them. I said, what about the big one, the man? He said, no, it got destroyed in the fire that went through the Advancement Council. And there wasn't much that, could do about that. That was gone and lost in fire. So, but the woman and the boy, we sort of re-erected a little bit to the best of our capabilities back here at Dumbartung. And, when people, again, senior Aboriginal people see these two statues, it just really, really has a massive impact on them because, again, if you're part of the Advancement Council being the centre part of our community in the 80s, 90s, the 70s,
60s.
and the 60s, and going way back, these statues were part of that history. They were first offered to the Aboriginal Advancement Council from the Bones department store. And, I tracked down by simply looking underneath one of the statues, which was of the little boy, and found a name, and it was an Italian name, and obviously the name of the sculpture. And I, anyway, again, joined dots and did a little bit of research, and I ended up in Balcatta talking to the family of the man who carved the statues. And I was talking, I think, to his son, and his son was telling me, and he was now a pretty elderly man, and he remembers, seeing his father carve the statues of these three Aboriginal people. They were like giant garden gnomes. People can remember something along them lines. And what happened was they were commissioned by, as I said, Bones, and they were put into the front window. Bones had a number of display windows in their huge department store in Perth. So every Christmas they would have what they would call their Christmas displays in the windows of the Bones department store, which was just off now where Forest Chase is. And anyway, at the end of the Christmas period, Bones had no further need for them. So they got in contact with the Advancement Council and offered our community these statues. And the statues would have gone out of sight and probably out of memory of a lot of Noongar people for, a couple of decades or more. And then bang, they ended up at Dumbartung. They're here now to this very day. And they were hopefully going to be part again of this proposed gallery because we were going to get them properly done up and put into a display cabinet, and the history. And that's what's really important here. The history of these statues were going to be written up, and for our young people to connect with some of that really old cultural connection in which senior Aboriginal people, were connected to all those years ago. And I think that's important when you look at Kyana, the gallery, and you start to understand that, the gallery is much, much more than, a gallery of just pretty pictures, paintings that, can be judged just by their face value. Goes much, much deeper. And the stories that merge from these artworks just aren't reflective of the artists' lives and what they lived through in the era in which they painted, particularly the prison artists, because, in some ways they were teaching each other. And this was a form of therapy within itself, within the imprisonment and the incarceration of our people, the sharing of this knowledge of how to paint. And this painting and paint works that were appearing would be a way in which senses of freedom would be touched on. And, this work was so powerful, it would start to melt the iron bars of the prison's systems and smash the concrete walls, in the sense that it would allow a sense of connection with country and with things that were important historically. Revel Cooper was painting things not only of corroboree grounds but massacre grounds. And, these stories that were coming through the art weren't a form of academic history or a form of academic learning. They were a form of our people telling our stories our way through these incredible art pieces. So although in prison, this sort of form of art had a way of its own self-therapy. And I think that's really important because, this art did generate itself really from the Carolup art in the mission, and then proceeded to, evolve within the major penal systems when those same artists, particularly Revel Cooper and Reynold Hart, started to serve, sentences within the jail systems as they got older. So I think, again, when you look at the collective and you look at the gallery, I think, the Kyana Gallery has, over and through all these decades, it's built up its own right in terms of what it's represented by in the lives of these artists, to have a place that, is and does give dignity to the history of these artists, because these artists these days are studied in fine art degree courses throughout most of the university fine arts degrees throughout Western Australia, and they're connected also to issues dealing with truth-telling, and they're connected also to healing programs that are run through universities. And through those connections, these artists are given great tribute, and recognition. But in the days that they were painting these incredible works, and the works that Dumbartung has in the collective, they were living on, as we said earlier, the fringes of East Perth. Their work was exploited, incredibly by the system and the institutions. And the lives in which you learn about in terms of when you study this art in, the fine art degree courses in universities and other TAFE accredited courses, it doesn't really tell of the life story of these people such as Revel Cooper and Reynold Hart. Revel Cooper's remains still, are in the ground in Victoria where he was murdered and have never been brought home. And he was buried and he passed away as a pauper. He knew of his ability and what his creativity was in relationship to art. And Dumbartung proudly, possesses a lot of his work, and we put a lot of emphasis on Revel Cooper because I think Revel Cooper, to our people, and here in the southwest, is as an admirable artist and is as gifted an artist as any Aboriginal artist has ever been in the modern history of Aboriginal art development, as it's been an attracted commodity worldwide, and that would include artists such as Namatjira, Clifford Possum, and artists from right throughout this country. Revel Cooper remains, our artist, representing our culture. And this again is why Kyana is so important and really important enough to fight for, because it's our culture and our right to the history to tell our story our way. And we'll conclude the second part of A Cultural Crime Against the Kyana Gallery. And before I conclude it with our maxim, I would say that our hope is that in the future, when things get really hard in terms of our people's fight for their rights and their identity, particularly, and their sense of belonging, that somewhere in the future where visionaries only see, and I'm talking 100, 150, 200 years from now, that somehow, somewhere, somebody finds the ember of Dumbartung's maxim. And in that ember, they see and find the history of the stories of Dumbartung, and in particular, the Kyana Gallery and its incredible collective. And may our campfires burn forever.